Welcome to the Knight and Rose Show, where we discuss practical ways of living out an authentic Christian worldview. I'm Wintery Knight.
And I'm Desert Rose.
Welcome, Rose. So today, we're diving into a topic that's increasingly urgent for Christians, the growing threat from organizations that label biblical beliefs and conservative values as hate, and how these groups are influencing corporations, government agencies, and even law enforcement to target and silence faithful believers. To help us unpack this issue with clarity and courage, I'm excited to welcome Tyler O'Neill, who is going to speak to us about one of those organizations, the Southern Poverty Law Center. Let me tell you a little bit about him first. Tyler O'Neill is the senior editor at the Daily Signal. He is the author of 2 books, Making Hate Pay, The Corruption of the Southern Poverty Law Center, that's published in 2020, and his latest book is The Woktopus, The Dark Money Cabal Manipulating the Federal Government, which came out in 2024. And I love that title. I was saying Woktopus for days after I saw it. A graduate of Hillsdale College, he is an Eagle Scout, husband, and father. He frequently covers topics like free speech threats, government weaponization against conservatives, and cultural issues, often testifying before Congress on these matters, such as in December 2025, where he highlighted attempts by leftist groups to silence him. Tyler, welcome to the Knight and Rose Show. It's a privilege to have you with us.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thank you. And by the way, we are both huge fans of Hillsdale College. Yes. And I was at the Acton Institute last year and sat at a table with, 8, 9, 10 young men from Hillsdale. I asked them all, so how does this happen that I didn't know they were from Hillsdale when we all first sat down. I said, okay, how does this happen that we've got like 8 or 10 outgoing, confident, Christ-loving, informed, conservative young men here at this conference? And they said, one of them said, we go to Hillsdale. And I was like, yes, that explains it.
Yeah. No, I mean, Hillsdale was fantastic when I went there, and it's only gotten better since.
Nice. Oh, that's encouraging. So tell us about the Southern Poverty Law Center. I mean, what's its mission? How does it get funding for that mission? What do we need to know?
Yeah, so the Southern Poverty Law Center, as many nonprofits do, started with a noble mission, but it got very, 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 very off track. And so essentially what it started to do, as the name suggests, was to provide legal representation for poor people in the South. And it did a very good job of doing that in its early years. It got people who were falsely convicted of rape off of death row. It actually represented a reverse racism case, and it helped Vietnamese fishermen who had also been abused. And there are some really good cases that the SPLC started with. But later, the co-founder, Morris Dees, he had family connections with the Ku Klux Klan. His uncle was a member, and he knew how evil the Klan was, and he wanted to move the organization into a direction of suing the Klan into bankruptcy. Now, of course, we all hear this and we think, oh, this must be an unmitigated good. The Klan is absolutely evil. Definition of a hate group. But the interesting thing here is, he started suing Klan groups, and it was the lawyers who were on those lawsuits said that it was like shooting fish in a barrel. The Klan was a paper tiger. And it wasn't just a paper tiger, it was also a really big moneymaker, because Morris Dees would lead the SPLC to bring a lawsuit against a Klan group. The Klan group would barely be able to defend itself in court. He'd win this massive multi-million-dollar judgment. And the Klan group had maybe 50 grand to its name totally. And it would completely go out of business. Thank God. Every Klan group gone is a good thing, in my opinion. But Morris Dees would go to his donors and say, we got this multi-million-dollar judgment. We're destroying these evil Klan groups. And the money would rake in all the money, because everybody, especially those Northern liberals, thought, oh, the Klan must be big in the South because we think the South is backward, knuckle-dragging, hick sort of mentality. And so the SPLC became, and it got so bad that in 1985, the entire legal team actually quit the SPLC because they told Morris Dees they didn't want to be primarily suing Klan groups. They wanted to actually help people who really needed it. So, this is a very interesting history. All that said, and that's like very much background, because the SPLC we know and very much do not love today takes that history and weaponizes it to demonize conservatives. And it's not just conservative. I usually say demonize mainstream conservative and Christian groups, but if you actually look at it, it's far more broad than that. There's an organization I know called Gays Against Groomers, which is a group of all LGBT people who, as an evangelical Christian, I disagree with what they, want to do with their sinful lifestyle that they identify with. But at the same time, you have to acknowledge it takes courage of them to say that they oppose the gender insanity that's being pushed on our children, that's making them vulnerable to sexual predation. And this sort of thing, like, I have tremendous respect for these people, and the SPLC decided they too belong on the hate map. So, and the worst thing about that is they have them on the hate map as an anti-LGBTQ extremist group. So they hate themselves,
oh, goodness.
But yeah, that's what the SPLC has become. And now, largely the big change happened in the 2000s. So they ran out of clan groups. I always like to say they ran out of grand dragons to slay. And they looked for ever more mainstream targets that they could, say, hey, we're going after these people. So first it was skinheads. They were kind of racist. They were pretty questionable. And then they started going after people who oppose illegal immigration. And then in 2010 is the big watershed year when they went after the Family Research Council. They made a point. It's very interesting. They went after Family Research Council, Liberty Council, a few other organizations, not even ADF at this point. But they said they would not put they would not put Focus on the Family on the hate map, because Focus on the Family had modernized, had become more moderate. And yet, fast forward to this year, maybe I shouldn't speed too fast, but they put Focus on the Family on the hate map this year. And this is after years of saying, ever since they first put conservative Christian groups on the hate map, conservatives and Christians said, look, the SPLC is anti-Christian. I mean, you can't be an organization that stands for marriages between a man and a woman without being put on this hate map. And the SPLC for a long time said, no, that's not true. And the one piece of evidence they had for it was that they didn't put Focus on the Family on the hate map.
Interesting.
And they had this language on their website for years. And so much so that they updated it, that it went from anti-LGBT to anti-LGBTQ. And only earlier 2025 or 2024, that language mysteriously disappeared from the website. So their whole defense for not being anti-Christian is gone. And I think that's a great way to immediately say, and you have funding on here, but I think we'll let you get a question in here.
So I was going to ask, how does the SPLC get their funding for this sort of mission? You mentioned donors, I think. Tell us more about that.
So the SPLC is independently very wealthy, and that's an aspect here. Their endowment is more than $740 million. Wow. That's like pretty much 750 million that they have. This is larger than almost the vast majority of nonprofits don't have anywhere near this much money. I mean, this is gobs and gobs of money that the SPLC has. Yeah. And it is really revealing. So the interesting thing here, and you have here listed, dark money contributions from Hopewell, Tides, I think it's the Tides Center, and groups connected with Arabella Advisors, RIP. By the way, Arabella Advisors has changed to be Sunflower Services now. That's an interesting dynamic that happened after my book, The Woktopus, was published, and after Scott Walter has his great expose on Arabella. But now they've decided that name is toxic. So positive step there, I think. Although I think they're still doing a lot of what they're doing. The thing about that, though, all that dark money funding helps the SPLC, but it's almost a drop in the bucket because the SPLC has its own big donor base. And I get, I have Google News alerts for the SPLC. And it breaks my heart to see one of these Google News alerts. It'll pick up somebody has died and they have on their obit, in lieu of flowers, please give money to the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Wow.
And every time I see that, I just, it guts me
Mm-hmm.
because I'm like, this person, if they really knew the truth, I don't think they would want their money to be going to this organization. But this organization, Morris Dees was the co-founder in 1976, I think it is, when you had the election. Well, first, no. It was 72, George McGovern.
Mm-hmm.
Morris Dees raised a huge amount of money for George McGovern. And then he also raised money for Carter's campaign in 76.
Okay.
And both of those campaigns, he was able to take his donor list and use it for the SPLC. So that's where the donor list started. But the SPLC has its own huge donor base. So yes, they're part of, they get money from the Left's Dark Money Network. And I think that's important to say because it shows how they're a useful tool for these other people. But it's not like if every one of these dark money engines were to disappear tomorrow and George Soros's son Alex were just to decide, I'm not going to send any money anymore. That wouldn't end the SPLC.
All right. So it sounds like they have this hate map where they're mapping conservative and maybe Christian organizations, and they're equating them with groups like the KKK. And you mentioned Family Research Council and the ADF, the Alliance Defending Freedom, that argues cases at the Supreme Court. So it sounds, like normal conservatives and Christians are being added to this. And that strikes me as really extreme.
Isn't Moms for Liberty and PragerU also targeted, maybe even TPUSA, Turning Point?
Yes, it is very extreme, and all those groups are on there.
Wow.
So this map, the SPLC says the map is exposing the infrastructure behind white supremacy in the United States. And that's a very interesting thing to say about conservative Christian groups, particularly Family Research Council, Alliance Defending Freedom. And then, of course, when you get to groups like PragerU, Moms for Liberty, Turning Point USA, these are just conservative organizations. And the SPLC is suggesting that they are hateful on par with the Klan.
Wow. So the SPLC's hate map has been linked to incidents of violence against Christians and conservatives, you said. What can you tell us about the 2012 FRC attack and anything kind of like that?
Yeah, I mean, it may sound ironic for most Christians to hear now, but Chick-fil-A used to be associated with, only supporting conservative Christian policies. This was, back in 2012. There was Chick-fil-A Appreciation Day. There was all this celebration of the fact that they were funding things like the Fellowship for Christian Athletes,
right,
which, by the way, is branded hateful, but it's really just a fellowship of Christian athletes. It's insane. But there was a guy who was radicalized by the SPLC. We know this because he told us this. And he took a bag of Chick-fil-A sandwiches and a semi-automatic pistol and went into the offices of the Family Research Council with the intent of shooting everyone in the building and smearing a Chick-fil-A sandwich in their faces.
Wow.
And the Family Research Council is a nonprofit think tank in Washington, D.C. that supports the traditional nuclear family and that puts out research on highlighting some of what they say are the concerns, health concerns, other concerns about homosexual activity, about family breakdown, about all these other things. And so, you don't have to necessarily agree with the FRC's positions here, but the idea that someone would go there planning to shoot everyone in the building and smear a Chick-fil-A, I mean, this is terrorism to the nines. And this is the sort of situation that, we hear it was covered in the media once or twice, and then they essentially moved on. But what happened here, thankfully, was that this attempted terrorist attack was foiled, and the guy ended up only wounding a security official at the Family Research Council. And it's a long-term wound. It was serious. But at the end of the day, thank God nobody died in this attack. And he ended up pleading guilty, being convicted on terrorism charges, the very first person ever to be convicted of DC's terrorism statute. And he is still serving his 25-year prison sentence for that. The other examples here are the Steve Scalise shooter, a man named James Hodgkinson, came and shot up the Republican practice of the congressional baseball game in 2017. And I think this one got more attention. This one, unfortunately, because he was killed in the resulting shootout, we don't know what he would have said, but he did like the SPLC on Facebook. And then finally, this is the biggest one to me, is last year, we all remember the assassination of Charlie Kirk. And that assassination took place only, I think it was 3 months after the SPLC released their new hate map for the year 2024. They released the hate map on the year following. So this year we'll get the 2025 hate map. But the 2024 hate map for the very first time had Turning Point USA on the hate map. And then we had this shooting, this horrific assassination of the founder of Turning Point USA. And this is from a guy who, Tyler Robinson said, I just couldn't take his hate anymore. So we don't have clear evidence that the SPLC directly inspired that shooting. But if you ask me, and I've said this many times, I think it is high time that the SPLC, they need to take far more than this off, frankly. But both Family Research Council and Turning Point USA, if the SPLC had any shred of, truth when they condemn political violence, they should have taken both of those groups off the hate map immediately after this news.
Definitely. So let's one more question about that hate map. Does the SPLC show an equal level of concern for hate speech and hate crimes against Christians and conservatives, such as in response to attacks on pro-life centers, compared to the incidents that we just discussed?
No. So this is one of the worst things about the Southern Poverty Law Center, is that they will put conservative and Christian groups on there, but they don't have Antifa on there. They don't have Jane's Revenge on there. They don't have, any of the groups that have been organizing anti-ICE protests, Burn a Tesla, Save Democracy protests, like all these things that you think, if they want to be categorizing hate in America and be taken seriously as not being biased, they should at least, mention that this group exists. No, none of that. So you get people like Moms for Liberty who are trying to get people elected to the school board through the legal process of an election. And they're on the hate map as an anti-government extremist group. Meanwhile, people who are hurling Molotov cocktails at government buildings, who you can't get much more anti-government extremist than that. Right. They're nowhere to be found and haven't been for years. So I think, it is high time that more of the legacy media, more of the moderate Americans, and frankly, many Democrats and liberals deal with the fact that this is an utterly biased organization.
The SPLC has had an influence on several big American corporations as well, like Amazon, Facebook, PayPal, YouTube. What kind of influence did the SPLC have with those companies, and what results did that influence produce?
Yeah. Thank God some of this influence has been pushed back against in recent years. So, Amazon Smile used to rely on the hate map to exclude conservatives. Amazon Smile no longer exists.
Right.
PayPal removed certain conservative and Christian groups. One of the very interesting things was Salesforce, and Salesforce runs Slack and Federation on American Immigration Reform, which is an organization that supports enforcing federal immigration law. This group was completely kicked off of Slack, just booted entirely and had their data taken from them because they're on the hate map. Wow. And so many of these, Google and YouTube used SPLC as a trusted flagger, a priority flagger for faster removal. Many of these, and there's another one, there's an even bigger one that I've been covering recently called Benevity, which helps companies give to organizations that their employees might believe in. And that's a very noble cause that Benevity is helping with. But they use, and this is a complicated question because Benevity claims they only use the SPLC hate map to screen people out if the company they're working with requests that they do that. I doubt that claim, but I don't have evidence that it's not true. We have had many companies, since we've raised this issue, since Heritage has raised this issue, and since I've been asking companies to comment, some companies have decided they will not be relying on they will not be relying on the SPLC hate map within Benevity going forward. So that is a step in the right direction. But rooting out this influence is a long-term struggle.
Definitely. I just want to say I'm in IT. That's why I spent the bulk of my career. So we use Slack and Salesforce in my current company. So these are huge companies that their products and services are used by huge numbers of information technology companies. And we don't use Benevity, but there's always pressure on employees to donate to the United Way as well. And you really have to be careful about where your money is going with them in terms of who they choose to, give money to. So it's something that touches on us because I think one of the ways that we have a voice as Christians is that we have the money that we earn, going to these charities that we care about. And when they get blocked off from programs and you can't give to them, then that's starving out voices, particularly like the ADF, which defends religious liberty. Okay, so let me ask you another question. The SPLC has had an influence on government agencies for a long time. For example, the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, and the FBI. And I've blogged about all these cases on my blog. So this is the stuff that bothers me. Can you tell us a bit what happened with those departments?
Yes. No, it should bother you. In fact, this is probably the worst aspect of the SPLC's influence, in my opinion, because the SPLC had worked with government to shift things. So like the biggest example that I think that many of us have heard about, although a lot of people don't remember that it was the SPLC involved, was when the FBI had that memo, the FBI Richmond memo, saying that they wanted to follow radical traditional Catholics. And this was essentially saying if you are, and the interesting thing about this whole issue is that the radical traditional Catholics that the SPLC puts on their hate map are actually an old list that are not very influential in conservative Catholicism anymore, which, just reveals yet another level of incompetence here. But the SPLC has this list of these radical traditional Catholic hate groups, and the FBI in Richmond decided it was a good idea to have a memo saying we need to be watching these people and we need to embed sources so that we can follow them. And this was after, I think it's important to say there was one incident where a violent person did go to a Catholic church after he had been engaging in some of his violent planning. But the idea that that should justify the SPLC's hate group accusations and that federal law enforcement should use this is just beyond the pale. And the other aspect, I've been covering Kristen Clark, who used to head the Justice Department Civil Rights Division under Biden for a while. And, she is a real piece of work. She had, this is when, if you remember, there were hundreds of attacks on Catholic churches and pro-life pregnancy centers after the leak of the Dobbs opinion.
Yeah.
And her agency is tasked with enforcing what's called the FACE Act, the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act. And she brought cases against pro-life protesters who were peaceful outside of these abortion clinics. Yep. And she ignored the rash of real violence. And when they were called on it, the DOJ essentially just said, oh, these attacks took place at night, so we can't find them or prosecute them or investigate them. And, but this lady, Kristen Clark, she led the division in a direction where they brought in the SPLC repeatedly. They advised the SPLC on the FBI's hate crimes. They gave them an embargoed report. The SPLC gave them an embargoed hate map report in 2023, which was the year that they put Moms for Liberty on the hate map for the first time. And they, Kristen Clark came and spoke with them. And then one of the other really shocking things to me was that the DOJ had the SPLC brief prosecutors on the threat of the anti-LGBTQ movement. Yeah. And the guy that they brought in was also the guy who recently defended the SPLC in putting focus on the family on the hate map.
Wow.
And this is the guy who said, and this really stood out to me because when he was defending putting focus on the family on the hate map, he said they push political notions that you cannot be a Christian unless you deny your true identity. The LGBT people can't be a Christian unless they deny their true identity. And he said that this was a dangerous and false notion. So the SPLC is saying from their high position of authority that if you believe that you can't celebrate LGBT lifestyles and be a Christian, that you are wrong and that you are dangerous. And, this is the organization that was advising the federal government.
Yeah, it's been kind of insane how, when I was growing up, people I interacted with who were homosexuals would say, I just want to be left alone. And for the last 20 years, it's been Christians and conservatives saying, I just want to be left alone. Yeah. Why are you forcing me to celebrate your sex life? I never asked anybody to celebrate my sex life. And now my job is on the line over it. My funding is on the line. My family's in danger if I don't celebrate. It's unbelievable how far things have come in a few decades.
Well, it's like they have the pride flag, and it is essentially forced on us in every venue.
Yes.
As this is diversity, this is celebration, this is dignity. And it's like, well, no, this is a debatable movement. And yes, I can have respect and love. I mean, as Christians, we're meant to love our neighbors and even our enemies. And I consider many of the people in that movement to be my enemies. But that doesn't mean you don't love them. And you can have basic dignity and recognition without endorsing their ideology. And particularly on the trans issue is just beyond the pale. I mean, that one is an old Christian Gnostic heresy weaponized for modern day, but it's and to make the medical industry rich. But I digress.
Yeah, let me say one quick thing. I'm going to tell a quick story. So I was working for the company that sponsored me for my green card, and they were FT100 and platinum partners of the Human Rights Campaign. And there was some kind of nightclub attack in Florida at that time.
The Pulse nightclub, which was carried out by a radical Islamist, by the way.
Right. So my manager came and brought me. They had a whole bunch of rainbow pins printed, and my manager came to my desk and said, "I noticed that you're not wearing one of these, so I brought you one." So, when you're working in corporate America, I'm sure everybody else has had experiences like this where you're really thinking about your promotion. Well, you're thinking about your promotion. I'm thinking about getting deported back to the crap country where I came from. Yeah. So that's what happens if you lose your job, and you're on a work permit. So this is big stuff. Like, am I allowed to be an authentic Christian and express authentic Christian convictions in public without being punished for it? And when you get the government and corporations involved, this is a big chunk of my life, So, and for the rest of the Christians as well. And I think, we are always asking, why don't Christians show more courage? Why don't they show, more strength in articulating their convictions? And I think, at least for guys who I work with who are Christians, they're running the calculations in their head, and they're saying, I'm not married. But the guys who are in my company who are married with kids, they're running that calculation, and they're saying, should I really say something at work or on social media or whatever that the government might find or a corporation might find when this could affect my ability to provide for my family. So this is real stuff. I mean, all right, let me go on with another question here. So there have been some scandals that have come out about the SPLC. So can you tell us a little? So can you tell us a little bit about that? They're not all angels, the way they might present.
Yeah. So there are so many scandals. It's hard to know exactly where to begin. I mean, I would say that the FRC shooting is a scandal. I would say that the assassination of Charlie Kirk is a scandal. But, one of the biggest obvious scandals is in 2019 when the SPLC fired their co-founder and, their president stepped down, one of their board members left the board, and it was all over these accusations and credible, longstanding accusations of racial discrimination and sexual harassment, particularly against Morris Dees, who was that co-founder. But, this culture where the SPLC would keep its Black staff in low positions. And, this from supposedly the premier civil rights organization is, being accused of racial discrimination here. And this scandal, it blew up in 2019, and then suddenly everybody forgot about it. The thing that stood out to me was 1 month later, the SPLC's interim president compared the SPLC to the Underground Railroad. So they're just acting as though nothing happened.
Wow.
The SPLC also has this very large amount of money in offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and investments overseas. And it's just like, why does a nonprofit organization need to have this money out there? This raises a lot of questions. And then they have many lawsuits that they've faced. So Majid Nawaz, who was a Muslim reformer, I haven't followed him in recent years, but he was branded an anti-Islamic extremist by the SPLC. And he sued for defamation and ended up getting a $3.7 million settlement in that legal case. Right now, the SPLC is currently also facing other lawsuits regarding their hate group accusation. One of the biggest ones that I thought was going to succeed but has recently hit a major hurdle is against D.A. King, whose organization, the Dustin Inman Society. The SPLC was on record saying they weren't a hate group in 2011, and then they changed their tune in 2018, calling it a hate group. They said that his organization focuses on vilifying all immigrants, which is a very interesting claim because D.A. King's sister is a legal immigrant, and there are 4 legal immigrants on the board of the Dustin Inman Society. So I thought this was a very strong case. A judge recently ruled in the SPLC's favor, granting summary judgment. They're deciding whether to appeal the case right now. But this was after, according to the attorneys who were on the case, they told me the judge protected the SPLC from some of the discovery that the attorneys wanted to carry out. So it remains to be seen if there's anything appealable in this ruling. But I still think the SPLC should be watching its back on defamation because that is the clearest case that can be made against them.
Right. So what can Christians and conservatives do to prevent this organization from weaponizing corporations and government agencies against us?
Yeah, there are a lot of things we can do. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that you could buy my book, Making Hate Pay, The Corruption of the Southern Poverty Law Center.
Yes.
But I'm glad you mentioned our ability to send our money to support things we believe in and don't believe in. There are groups out there like the Heritage Foundation, like Jerry Bowyer. I don't remember what his company is called, but there are good conservative groups that are trying to use investment money to push the needle. So for a long time, we had DEI and ESG, that's diversity, equity, and inclusion, and environmental, social, and governance standards that were pushed on corporations by these activists who, were like venture capitalists and others who said, only if you do certain things are we going to send money to your company. And
is it Bowyer Research, his company?
Yeah, Bowyer Research. Yeah, that's right. And what they're doing right now is they're trying to use the same tools that the left used to dominate corporate America and to weaponize it. And they're using those tools to bring sanity back, to, to make it a neutral space again, because unfortunately it hasn't been a neutral space. And we don't want, so it's just like with the Doge situation in the federal government. We don't want the federal government to be shoveling money at conservative groups the same way that it was shoveling money at liberal groups. I think that sort of tit for tat is not what we want. We want our money to go to things that actually improve the lives of the American people. And similarly, when it comes to this sort of shareholder activism, we want companies to be focused on making money for their shareholders, enabling all of us who invest to be able to, have a return on our investments so that we can then use that money to benefit causes we believe in. We don't think corporations should be choosing which nonprofits they should be propping up and shifting the nonprofit ecosystem in that direction. We don't want them shifting it in a conservative direction. We don't want them shifting it in a liberal direction. We want individual consumers and people who are making the money to make our own decisions, to give to causes we believe in, and have a neutral public square.
Absolutely. Yes, definitely. We've actually done 3 episodes on socialism and the problems with that. And you just touched on one big reason. So are there any other specifics you can think of as far as, what Christians and conservatives might do?
Yes. At the end of last year, I testified in Congress about the negative impacts of the SPLC. And I think any sort of sharing that people can do of that would be helpful. When it comes to, so I think the main message that we have to constantly share in any arena we can where we have an impact is that the SPLC is an organization that is beyond the pale. Anyone who's defending them should be ashamed. And we should be able to say, look, you can, some of the SPLC stuff is good on the side, but what they focus on doing, what makes their most money, and what their message mainly is demonizing people for what they believe in, and particularly for holding conservative and Christian positions in the public square. And this is beyond the pale. So if you work at a company that, uses benevity, and I don't necessarily expect everybody to know that immediately, but if you see that benevity is there, if you have any opportunity to tell your bosses, hey, look, I see we use benevity, that's good, but I want to make sure that they're not using the SPLC to screen our potential donors. And you can do test runs, try to give to Alliance Defending Freedom or the Family Research Council or Turning Point USA or PragerU, and see if that comes back negative, if you're prevented from that. And then there are 2 other things we can do. One is we can pray that our country will wake up to this. And 2, and I mean, this is something, I am a nonprofit, 501c3 employee, so I can't tell you how to vote. But I can say that our votes make a difference. And when you see someone at the top of the ticket, when you see someone who is likely to bring into an administration the sort of people that Biden brought into his administration. I mean, this ties directly into my second book, The Woktopus, where I traced all of the left-wing activist groups that sent their ideas and their staff into the Biden administration. Now, I pray that the Democratic Party wakes up and shoves off this stuff, because I think I want us to live in a country where we have 2 sane political parties, where we're not fighting tooth and nail and scared if the other side wins. I want us to have a system of natural checks and balances where you can have Democrats who say, look, we understand you're a conservative Christian. We don't want to demonize you. We don't want to vilify you. We don't want to kick you out of the public square. And therefore, we're never going to do anything with the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I want Republicans who will say the same thing. And if we get to that point, then I wouldn't be saying what I'm about to say here. But I think it's all clear to all of us that that's not the world we live in. And when you choose who you vote for, and I think you should vote if you're a legal citizen in this country, especially if you are a Christian, you should vote. And you should vote against anyone who poses an existential threat to those who preach the gospel.
Yes.
And I'm sorry, I don't like to say this, but we have in this country a party that is lining up in various ways to vilify the traditional understanding of the gospel and Christianity. Yep. And we cannot forget that. And I understand if we all want to be above politics. I think ideally we should be. But we can't sit on our keisters and let somebody else make these decisions for us, because we've seen what happens when that happens.
Right.
And that was what we saw under the previous administration.
Yeah, definitely. Like for me, our podcast is generally more about Christian apologetics and evidential apologetics. But even then, we bring on scholars like Guillermo Gonzalez, who co-wrote a book with Jay Richards on the argument for design. And he got canceled by employers for disagreeing with naturalistic evolution. Yeah, there's a group of people who just don't like the idea that Christians are going to integrate their faith with their public lives. And the scary thing is the use of power to stop Christians from doing that. So for me, I'll say something about the previous administration. So I didn't like Kristen Clark at all. I wrote about her, didn't like her. And I didn't like, I think the FBI guy might have been Christopher Wray, but there's a bunch of them that I who are really, I think, just not accepting that there are some people who are, on the other side of them on policy issues and who can make their case. I mean, I understand if you like raising minimum wage, but I've read Thomas Sowell and I have a reason for disagreeing with raising minimum wage. And if your response to me disagreeing with you is not to say, well, tell me what Thomas Sowell says, you say, oh, I don't want to hear what you've read. I know that people who think like you are complete idiots and we can use the law to mistreat them and coerce them. Well, just, that's where you've gone too far. So, yeah, people like Harmeet Dillon who have come in, I feel she has done a great job. Kash Patel cut ties with the SPLC. He's the head of the FBI. I believe he also cut ties with the ADL, which has some concerning, policies as well.
Yeah, he did. And ADL is moving itself in a better direction recently.
Yes, and that's good.
But yes.
Yeah. So I think we do get heroes put in when we vote. Sometimes, and sometimes we get villains removed. And I would say if you don't know much about these cases, probably a good idea is to get Tyler's book and get informed about what kinds of issues are affecting Christians in these areas.
Yeah, there's a whole lot more at stake than just, whose personality do I like better? Whose tweets do I like better?
That's what I was thinking, under the surface is take it down from the top guy. Start thinking about specific cases, and specific cabinet members, picks. Like there's a huge difference between Chris Wright on energy policy versus someone like Tim Waltz, who is like, a net zero person. Like you're just going to pay less for everything energy related. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. But
Richard Levine, it was great to see HHS. And sometimes I'm not always the biggest fan of like the small digs that this administration has had against the previous one. But seeing HHS acknowledge the fact that Rachel Levine is actually a man and was a man even when he was at a leadership role at HHS, like that is because these things are true. And that's the other aspect is we have, and when it comes to transgenderism, I mean, we have a demonic cult that is controlling so much of our institutions. And that's not to say that everybody who supports transgender ideology is evil. I'm not saying that. But I do think that the actual thing itself is a very destructive lie, and it is evil. And there are some well-meaning people who are hoodwinked by it. And I think that many of the people who believe themselves to be transgender are actually struggling, and we should have compassion for them. But that doesn't mean we kowtow and change society just to, to prop up their illusion.
There's a lot at stake for telling the truth, acknowledging what is true. and speaking up about what's true. So we very much appreciate your work, Tyler, in speaking the truth. Is there anything else that we didn't touch on already that you want to talk about or mention?
Well, thanks so much for having me. I think there are so many other things I could bring up. Some of the stuff, I like to make a point of personal privilege that I was blessed to be the one to break the news that the FBI under Kash Patel separated from the Southern Poverty Law Center. And, I was nominated for a lot of my reporting on the way that our tax dollars have been abused by the federal government. I was nominated for a Dow Prize about that last year. But all of this is part of trying to open everybody's eyes to the real threat that the left poses. There are some things that I think conservatives should be able to say, like, look, yeah, we like the minimum wage, I think was a good example that Wintery Knight brought up. Like, I think the minimum wage is a bad policy that harms people, and I'm going to make the arguments. But my faith does not stand or fall on the minimum wage. And I think Christians, well-meaning Christians who believe the gospel, can fall on either side of that issue. On transgenderism, on the Southern Poverty Law Center, on abortion, on a few other issues, I don't think you can be a genuine Bible-believing Christian and disagree and come on the other side of certain issues. And that's not to say that politics is our end goal or our ultimate thing. I think our ultimate faith and our value is in God, and we should always keep that front and center. But there is a reason why I will fight tooth and nail for the truth on these things, because I think that, it is not just my duty as a journalist to tell the truth. It is also my duty as a Christian to stand against this evil.
Absolutely. Yeah. Amen to that. And we so appreciate your work. Speaking of your work, what are you working on now? And where can we find your work online? I would love for our followers to find you and find your work.
Thank you. Yeah, you can follow me. The place where I'm most active is X, the platform formerly known as Twitter. My handle is Tyler2 O'Neill. You can also find my Substack. It's just called Woktopus. You can subscribe there. I'm on, dailysignal.com is where all my stuff goes out. And right now I'm working on an op-ed about how egregious it is that Representative Ilhan Omar, who I say is D representing Somalia, is encouraging a neo-Confederate opposition to the enforcement of immigration law. This is the sort of thing the left is echoing the rhetoric that we saw from the Confederates. And of course, when it comes to enforcing immigration law, it's not the same sort of issue as slavery. It's not as evil necessarily. But what they are trying to do is erase immigration law and demonize those who try to enforce it.
Wow.
Right.
And that rhetoric is very similar to what the South did in the lead up to the Civil War and, essentially was the point of seceding when Abraham Lincoln became president. And I think this is an issue we need to constantly remind people because, Ilhan Omar said that ICE is an occupying force in Minneapolis. And you can disagree with some of the way that ICE is enforcing immigration law, but to call them an occupying force is dangerous.
All right. So, Tyler, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast and talking to us about these very important issues. And we have learned a lot from your time with us.
Thank you. Thanks again so much for having me.
All right, listeners, if you enjoyed the episode, please consider helping us out by sharing this podcast with your friends, writing us a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify, subscribing and commenting on YouTube, and hitting the like button wherever you listen to the podcast. We appreciate you taking the time to listen, and we'll see you again in the next one.